Welcome. Thank you all again for attending the 2020 Behavioral Health Symposium. We are happy to host this event as a virtual conference because we care about your health and safety, but we are also understand how important it is to provide relevant and robust continuing education to Louisiana healthcare professionals at this time. For quality purposes, all participants will be muted during the presentation. If you would like to submit a question to the speaker, please use the Q&A feature in the virtual platform. Accreditation. This session is accredited for 1.0 hours for the following: social workers, a clinical credit; licensed professional counselors; peer support specialists; psychologists; nursing contact hours; and AMA PRA Category 1 credits. Full participation is required to receive credit and will be monitored throughout the session. You will receive an email from Women's Foundation with detailed instructions on how to claim your credits and access your certificates. Additional information is available in the digital event book. Financial disclosures. Heather Prejean, our speaker for this plenary session, has no financial disclosures. None of the members of the symposium's planning committee or any session moderators have any financial disclosures. Now that we have all of the business out of the way, it is my pleasure to introduce to you all Ms. Heather Prejean for our lunchtime plenary presentation on grief and loss in unprecedented times. This session, our presenter has over 20 years of professional experience as a licensed clinical social worker and a board-certified and a board-approved clinical supervisor. Ms. Prejean has served in various roles, including mental health provider, program developer, and evaluator for nonprofit programs, and clinical director of inpatient and outpatient psychiatric services. As a leader in the field, she has served on multiple leadership teams, assisting in staff development and performance improvement. Currently, Ms. Prejean serves as Executive Director of Acadiana Center for Loss and Transition. She is a member of the National Association of Social Workers and the Association of Death Education and Counseling. For the past 3 years, Ms. Prejean has managed a bereavement program for palliative care and hospice care, expanding the grief program to provide support to patients, family members, and the community at large experiencing grief related to life transitions, anticipation of loss, complicated grief, and disenfranchised grief issues. Most recently, Ms. Prejean has developed and implemented programming adaptations and created new platforms for services and education to meet the needs of those grieving as related to or influenced by the pandemic, while supporting and educating leaders and organizations in the community that are encountering increased grief experiences. Wow, we are so grateful to have you here with us, Ms. Prejean. So please let's give a great virtual welcome to Heather Prejean.
Oh, thank you so much. That was, her voice is so lovely and soft. Thank you. I do want to take a minute to thank the Louisiana Department of Behavioral Health for creating such an amazing symposium. I wish I could see the behind the scenes. They are working very diligently to make sure that it's as seamless as possible. And we all know, for anyone who's put together events, there's a lot of hard work that goes on behind the scenes. I also want to thank them for recognizing and acknowledging that grief and loss is absolutely an experience or a response that most of us are experiencing through the pandemic. And I am honored to be the person today to share some information about that with you. Well, as I was putting together the presentation, I found that I was looking at this information from 3 different perspectives, and I was looking at it from a personal or individual perspective. I was also looking at it as a healthcare professional who provides services to clients, but I was also looking at the information as a person who works with my peers, alongside my peers, providing the service, and thinking it's important to acknowledge the grief and loss we're all experiencing, and really to tend to some of that information. So what I would encourage you today is, as you listen through as you're sitting there through the presentation, you may naturally find yourself listening as an individual, but and as a provider to your clients, I also want you listening as a professional who's working with other peers, and you can be a support to those peers as well as you gather knowledge from this presentation. So we will move on to looking at our 3 objectives that we're going to cover today. And the first objective, naturally, is to take a look at the multiple grief responses that we may be seeing through the pandemic, and take a look at we know loss in terms of death, but we want to take a closer look of the expanded losses that are experienced through the pandemic. That's our first objective. Our second objective is to be able to recognize someone who is grieving. Once we are able to understand it, we want to be able to see it and recognize it. So of course, then we can apply it, which would be our third objective. Once we understand it, and then we can recognize it either in ourselves or people we're working with, the last and final objective is, what can we do to help? So with that being said, we'll go ahead and get started. Our first objective is to really learn about what is grief. And simply put, grief is a natural response to a loss. It's very common. It's actually very healthy to experience grief. Today, though, I wanted to expand our knowledge of beyond the death of a person, not to minimize the death of a person and how significant that is to us. But when we're looking at grief through a pandemic, we really need to expand of the different grief responses that we're going to see. So the first piece is I wanted to show you the very shortened and maybe oversimplified definitions of grief. That would be what most of the majority of what people understand to be grief. We can see that it's deep sorrow, especially that caused by a death. And the next one is deep, poignant distress caused by or as if by bereavement. And again, they're relating to grief in a response to a death. Here are more accurate, more flexible definitions of what true grief responses can be. And I would like you to really focus on the last two, who, when they talk about loss, they're referring to a change of pattern in behavior or the end of something. So we're recognizing that grief is in response to when something ends and changes, we are going to have a respond to that. The last one is the most evolved definition of grief, and it's based on decades of research from Jord Bannon, and it's a natural adaptive reaction, a painful but necessary mental calibration to accommodate new absence. So that definition really shows that for many people, especially in the work that I do, it's teaching them and acknowledging for them that even though you may not have experienced the death of someone, you may be experiencing a significant absence or change, and that will absolutely give you a grief response. You can actually grieve from experiencing those changes and transitions. And I think it's safe to say that through the coronavirus pandemic, we've experienced many changes or absences of what we know to be normal. I can't do a grief and loss presentation without giving you a couple of definitions that surround what we would traditionally know to be grief. So just to clarify some definitions, grief we know is a natural reaction to a loss. Bereavement it's specific to someone who had died. So it's a reaction to experiencing the death of a person, and you would define the person to be bereaved. If someone says they're bereaved, we know that they are grieving because someone died. And then we have mourning. Mourning is or defined as an external or public expression of grief. And as you can see in the definition, it's influenced by different factors. And because of these factors, the way that individuals mourn may look very different. And that's an important piece of information for you to remember as we go along. Our mourning is definitely influenced maybe by our own personal beliefs. It's also influenced by maybe our religious practices or our religious beliefs, and it's definitely influenced by our cultural context. And culturally, we may be impacted by society. It's what's okay and not okay in terms of mourning. But keep in mind that individually, mourning is not the same for all. So let's take a look at, now that we know a great definition of grief or a more expansive definition of grief, let's take a look at the different types of grief. And I'm just going to let them kind of fly into the screen. Okay, so I think here's our comprehensive list of the many different types of grief. These are actually definable griefs. And if we take a look at the list, they're usually defined in two ways. It's one, either the way the loss was experienced, or I should say this, it's how the loss occurred. So a grief might be defined on how that loss occurred. And then the second type of categorized grief is how people are responding to that loss. So I just wanted to give you a visual. These are 13 different types of grief that's actually definable. But to keep it simple, and because we're talking about grief and loss during the pandemic, I'm going to focus in on 5 specific griefs that we may certainly see during the pandemic, and you may have also even seen some of these in your own self. So anticipatory grief. Anticipatory grief is the profession that I work in is hospice care, and we absolutely see maybe the terminally ill patient experiencing anticipatory grief. What we would normally know as anticipatory grief is a person understands that they are terminally ill and they are grieving the fact that they know their life will end. But through the pandemic, we are experiencing an anticipatory grief. It's a bit ambiguous and a little different than what we traditionally know it, but we understand that something is different, something has changed, and we don't know the extent as to how far will these changes occur in our lives. So we're anticipating it and we're knowing that it's going on, but we, unlike the person who knows they're going to die, we don't know what specific changes will occur. We only know that a lot has changed. And rooted in anticipatory grief, you will see emotions of anxiety and fears. And I can personally tell you that I've had maybe moments of anxiety and fear of what is going on, how much of a change will this pandemic impact my life? And it comes and goes, I will say. It's like a breath. It's like an inhale and an exhale sometimes with anticipatory grief. Then we have collective grief. So what we traditionally know as collective grief is maybe an icon in our community dies and the community grieves collectively, or someone in our family grieves and the dies, and someone in our let me get this right. Someone in our family dies, and together the family members collectively grieve. So we are used of those types of situations to collectively grieve. The pandemic has brought on the fact that we're not just individually grieving, we're not just grieving as a community or a nation, we're actually grieving together globally. And that is why this is called unprecedented times, is we have never experienced the amount of collective grief that we're experiencing now. Cumulative grief, I want you to keep in mind that this is a very natural thing. I can reference hospice care. There are times when the bereavement department is called in because a family has experienced maybe a death within the last year, and then someone in their family, another close family member, was put on hospice care. And that would be identified as a cumulative grief situation, where they're starting to grieve this person who's on hospice care, but it's bringing up maybe the loss they've encountered within the past year. And that would be a more normal circumstance of cumulative grief. But throughout the pandemic, we're experiencing a higher level of losses in a very short period of time, whether that be loss of life or the many other expansive amounts of losses that we're coming across through the pandemic. And I do specifically want to point out healthcare workers. We are on the front lines, and we are absolutely experiencing cumulative grief at a rate that we have never experienced before. So if I'm making the case or building the case, or I hope to be building the case that not only do our clients and our citizens in our community need support, but our healthcare workers need that support built into their peers and built into their organization as well, to help validate and take care of that grief. A disenfranchised grief, and you can see the definition on the screen, it's a grief that persons experience when they incur a loss that is or cannot be openly acknowledged, publicly mourned, or socially supported. So there are many different examples that I can give you, but I will say that sometimes we self-impose the disenfranchisement onto ourselves, right? Being a healthcare worker, or being the caretaker of many people, or provider to many of our clients or patients. We may be internally telling ourselves, if we've experienced loss, that suck it up, you have work to do and the next person to take care of, and we kind of put our own grief aside, and we don't honor our grief, and this is probably not the healthiest thing to do. There's some other disenfranchised grief experiences. One would be, we know we have a lot of deaths from coronavirus, but we also have families who've experienced the death of a person in the hospital that died or did not die by the virus. And because it's not publicly acknowledged, the numbers of those types of deaths are not being shared on TV. At times, those families can feel that their grief is disenfranchised. So be on the lookout. These are people who would need validation and acknowledgement that they, in fact, are grieving, and it is a valid loss, even though the loss is not due to their person having coronavirus. So the last and final grief that I wanted to identify is complicated grief. Most grief responses are very natural and very normal. The first four above would be normal reactions to loss. Complicated grief is a more serious and maybe diagnosable type of grief. Although the chances of someone experiencing complicated grief are low, I did want you to know about it, because this pandemic has brought on, as I mentioned before, cumulative griefs, lots of losses, and we may have an increased chance of seeing people with complicated grief. But it's when they have extreme experiences and their process through the grief journey is really having difficulty transforming, and the person is having difficulty transforming and kind of adapting through their grief journey, and it becomes non-functional, or they're functionally impaired, and that would be defined as complicated grief. All right, so as part of the first objective was to identify the many different types of grief and define those for you just so you have a greater knowledge. The next part of the first objective is to take a look at the expansive losses that we've experienced globally throughout this pandemic. But before I give you the information, I did want to take a minute to poll you as the audience, and I'd like you to take a moment. I do have that grief is a normal response to loss. I would like us to take a minute. I want you to think about how many losses have you experienced through the pandemic up to now. I will say either you or someone that you know, if you'd prefer maybe to use a different person and count up how many losses you know they've occurred, you know that they've experienced through the pandemic. You can also add to that number if you want to put maybe the most significant loss that you've experienced during the pandemic. I can't see them either. She's saying, in my view, I should be able to see your responses, but evidently I need glasses. Sure.
So we're getting that some various numbers of losses since the pandemic. Some have 5 within 3 months. From Faye, we have someone lost 2, some say 3, some say 4. Jody says, I lost my dad and couldn't have a funeral due to COVID. Terrible. So those are some of the comments we're getting back in the poll question.
Yes. Even 2 losses in a short period of time is almost unheard of and very unique. In the hospice world, we call this high risk for bereavement, to have experienced 2 losses in a very short period of time. And I will say that we'll see in the next few slides that I would imagine most people are putting the loss of life, the deaths that they have experienced through the pandemic. What we're about to see is there are so many different types of losses in addition to deaths. It's just building the case that you will be needed, and you are needed now, in order to for some prevention purposes, to help slow down or help people work through their grief journey so it does not manifest into something that's unhealthy. So thank you all for sharing. I appreciate you sharing the number of losses, and I will tell you that we are here, and I hope that you are tending to any grief that you have, because it's very natural and normal, and you are certainly not alone. In this next slide, I created a list, and this is not these are not, this list, there are probably many more losses that have occurred, but in all the research that I completed, here is the majority of information that seemed to be very prevalent in most of the research. But we, number 1, have a loss of normalcy. Absolutely. A loss of connection. A loss of our day-to-day routine. With this pandemic, we have experienced so much chaos, and we've been reconstructing and adapting, I think, from the very beginning, and we continue to adapt. So our loss of routine, we probably lost that a long time ago. Loss of safety and security. So the list goes on, and I don't want to read the whole list to you, but I do want to point out that some of these losses are like a domino effect. Our person who put that she lost her dad and she was unable to do the follow through with the burial ritual. I don't have loss of life on this list, and that's not to minimize. That's only because the first thing we think of with grief and loss is the death of a person, and that has absolutely occurred through the pandemic. I also wanted to create this list to highlight for you the additional losses maybe we haven't even considered. But let's take the death of a person, which may have led to also the loss of our ability to carry out the end of life care that we had planned to carry out. You may not have been able to be by the bedside while that person died. And then the person dies and you cannot carry out the burial rituals that maybe you had planned and wanted to. You also were not able to connect with the family members who would come and support you. So there are, in that one experience of experiencing the death of your person, there are so many losses that came along with that. And then we take loss of employment. Loss of employment is just the beginning. And then we have loss of financial security, loss of health care, our medical insurance, and that just keeps driving up our loss of sense of safety and security. And so I would bet for those of us who put the number of losses, that now that we see the list, it's a lot higher, the amount of loss that we've experienced. Traumatic loss, I could not go through the losses with you without focusing in on traumatic loss. That is usually definable by the person experiencing the loss. So I wanted to bring it to light. I want us to acknowledge it and know that it may exist. And under what circumstances someone may experience a traumatic loss. It's more the exception than the rule, but let's take a look at the definition. The risk of experiencing trauma or traumatic loss is heightened for certain groups. And look at here, including frontline workers or frontline clinicians, ill patients, families who've lost loved ones under circumstances of isolation, hardship, and at times unexpected death. And I think we know, due to the nature of coronavirus, there were many unexpected deaths that occurred where someone seemed very healthy and fine, and or maybe even had the virus and the symptoms were not great, but they weren't terrible. And I think the nature of the illness, I've heard for some that could switch within 24 hours and death occurred. So and of course, for our frontline clinicians who are maybe, we may, as a matter of fact, that'll probably get to our next slide. Let's go ahead and look at, I again wanted to hone in on our healthcare workers and the different losses that they may be experiencing. And specifically, specific to you all, or specific to us all, is cumulative loss greater than normal patient deaths. I know that for some, death is a normal part of the work that they do, not that we minimize that, but it doesn't come as often as it was coming in the coronavirus pandemic. And if you jump down to the bottom of the list, it hasn't only been deaths of their patients, it's deaths of their family members, and also deaths of their coworkers, deaths of their colleagues. This is why the pandemic is unprecedented. And again, driving home the message to you all that we should absolutely be taking care of our healthcare workers, ourselves, our peers, and our organization. I think we naturally know that we are here to take care of our clients and our patients, but sometimes I want you to look to the left and to the right and see the people who are surrounding you and take time to see if they're struggling with any grief issues. And then the rest on the list is our frontline workers experienced a lot of loss of control, which was out of their control and out of a lot of our controls. We talk about limited access to equipment, few treatment options when it came to the coronavirus and the pandemic, lack of our community's response to safety. It's not unusual. We'll see later in the phases of a disaster that there's some chaos and some misunderstandings that typically and traditionally happen in the beginning of disasters, and the domino effect of that is for those who are trying to help, sometimes it feels very out of control and chaotic for them. And then secondary losses, where they're at work experiencing lots of stress and chaos, returning home, and then home not being normal. And actually, for most of us who did not work in a setting that was high risk for coronavirus, we maybe return home to a safe setting. For our healthcare workers who were on the front lines, they returned home with fear and anxieties of bringing it back home to their families. So there are lots of things that were happening and going on in terms of our losses. And we can and will have grief responses to all of these natural losses. Well, not so natural, to all of these losses that we experienced through the pandemic. So I would say I'm hoping that we accomplished our objective one. Objective one was really meant to grow an awareness of how many different types of grief responses we have, and to really give you an expansive view of the countless different losses that we have been experiencing on top of the loss of life through the pandemic. And with that being said, since we now know about grief and know the many different grief responses we can have, and we know that we've experienced so much loss, the next natural question would be, well, how would I recognize someone who is experiencing grief? How would I know it? I mentioned earlier that we mourn differently, so it doesn't look the same from one to the other, but we still want to help and need to help. So our next step would be, how do we recognize grief? And this was just, I'm not going to spend too much on this slide, but it does say, what does a grieving person really look like? And it can be typical normal responses. It can definitely be atypical or manifest into something not as healthy. And I do want you to be aware of that as well. All right, signs and symptoms of grief. So I just said it's very natural and normal to grieve. What a lot of times impacts our grief is the type of losses that we've experienced and how the loss occurred. Also, our personality, our life's history, our cultural practices, and the magnitude or the connection to what we lost. Depending on how connected we were to it, it can drive up that emotional reaction of grief. So we typically look at two types of responses that are manifested by grief. We have physical responses, and then we have emotional responses. So here's a list of some physical responses that you may see in yourself, in your peers, or in your clients who are experiencing grief. Again, they may not experience all of the above. They may experience all of the above, but just have your knowledge, have your awareness ready. And if you start to see some of these flare up greater than normal, then it might be something worth addressing and asking about. I did want to take a little bit of time, and they're all equally important, but fatigue is high on the list for those people who are grieving. Although I would say we're probably all tired of adapting and changing through the pandemic, but fatigue, let's talk about our coworkers, or even ourselves, if we recognize or start to see that we're struggling to complete our responsibilities at work, if we are having difficulty with that fatigue, concentrating and remembering things, or if we see our coworker experiencing the same thing, making mistakes that they would not typically make, that's a warning sign. That's a red flag, so to speak, for maybe us to have a conversation with them and check in on them and how are you, okay? The other piece, and this is in the emotional symptoms, there's lots of different emotions. With grieving, we always say there's no wrong emotion, but here are some of the more prevalent emotions you'll see. And yes, detachment and numbness is on the list. And this is kind of when we start to head into maybe some burnout, and we're feeling disconnected and overwhelmed by our grief. But I want to focus in on guilt and anger. Guilt we may be seeing guilt in our healthcare workers because they were performing the work that they performed under stressful and chaotic situations that they had no control over. I'll give you for example, because we've had many conversations at the hospice company where I work, in our nurses, right, especially in the beginning of the pandemic and the stay-at-home order, we were going into the homes less often. And I will tell you, some family members were saying, no, thank you, I don't need you to come in. So that was a safety precaution. And our nurses, our chaplains, our social workers struggled and still struggle, not hugging a patient, not providing the care to the standard that they would have provided pre-coronavirus. They have a sense of, did I help as much as I could have? They have guilt feelings about not providing the standard of care they feel like they could have provided had the coronavirus pandemic not occur. And then I also wanted to point out anger is that I know that Dr. Blunt earlier, I sat in on his presentation and he talked about some people, we're a bit grouchy. And yes, we are, because we are grieving and we've had so much loss and we're trying to work through and adapt that, that anger is not an uncommon emotion that we're feeling because we're grieving. And again, it's like an inhale and an exhale. Sometimes it comes and goes. But if you're starting to notice that it's constant and lasting longer than normal, again, it might be a red flag that someone is absolutely experiencing a response, a grief response. All right. I can't go without talking about complicated grief symptoms. In the slide, it says a minority will be at risk following their losses for mental and physical complications. So do know that it's more the exception again than the rule, but it's worth taking a look at because I want you to be educated and informed enough to be able to recognize it if you see it. So there are three components to complicated grief. There's three components for the signs and symptoms. And basically, because we know grief is normal, and I will tell you, grief has no timeline. There's no beginning and end, and there's no, you should be finished with that at this point. So I agree with all of those things. Complicated grief, it's at some point, or there is a point in time where it begins to be maladaptive. And that's what we're going to focus in on, the signs and symptoms of complicated grief. So the first criteria for and I do want to tell you that complicated grief is actually a diagnosable illness in the DSM-5. So what that tells me is we're looking at true difficulty functioning, so much so that this is when, if you haven't asked for help before, it's really time to get the professionals in and seek out help, so it doesn't continue to manifest. But all right, first factor of complicated grief to take a look at and to recognize are maladaptive thoughts. So typically, we are trying to, typically we feel very vulnerable after experiencing a loss. Our world has changed. We're trying to make sense of it. We realize that some things are not a guarantee. So that's a very natural experience. And it's very natural and normal to have grief and or have anxiety and some fears after someone dies. But when does it become maladaptive? It becomes maladaptive when it's persistent and ruminating about fears of the future, and we can't survive it and it won't be okay. And I'm not saying that someone grieving initially doesn't have those thoughts, But naturally, we begin to reconstruct and transform ourselves through the grief journey and start to find new ways of living and kind of building upon that. It becomes maladaptive if we never get there, if we never get to the point of we're trying to reconstruct, and we just keep honing in, our thought process keeps honing in on the future's terrible, and I'll never be able to survive without this person, or with this new way of living. I won't be able to survive it. So keep that in mind. Then we have the second component of complicated grief. It's called dysfunctional behaviors. Very naturally, I'll go with when someone dies. When someone dies, naturally, we're not big into the social scene. We also try and avoid, very normally, maybe things that trigger that deep sorrow. We're already grieving. We already feel the heaviness, the deep sorrow. And we are not looking for anything to make us feel worse. And that's very normal and natural. But when it comes to complicated grief, it's a little bit different, because we never evolve and transform into maybe slowly getting back to gathering with a few people. And we just continue to avoid. The characteristic of dysfunctional behavior and complicated grief is really avoidance. It's very natural in the beginning. It's not so natural as we continue to work through the grief process. So if you see someone continuously avoiding, it's maybe manifesting into something unhealthy. And the last piece of complicated grief that I wanted you to be aware of is inadequate emotion regulation. Well, initially in a loss, I often say grief equals chaos. Our emotions are everywhere. It's hard for us to kind of rein them in. It just feels like our emotions are taking over our body. Very natural, very normal. It does get better. People definitely want to hear that, especially when they're in the midst of the chaos of grief. At some point, though, as human beings, we naturally begin to, again, reconstruct and work towards the ability to put aside some of those emotions, because we want to function. Most people, some days are better than others, but most of us want to make some progress. Very natural, very normal. If we get to a point where we can't, and we just consistently focus on things that keep driving up that emotional arousal, then that gets to a really, then it's out of control and we're unable to regulate it. So again, complicated grief is not something that's normal or something that's seen in high numbers, but we are in the coronavirus pandemic, and we have been inundated with many changes and, again, many losses. So could we see more complicated grief responses? Yes. And so I want you prepared and ready with your knowledge of what that looks like. Okay, so I think we've accomplished objective 1, which is defining our grief and losses. I hope I accomplished objective 2, which is getting you to be able to recognize what that looks like in ourselves and our peers, and of course in our clients and patients. And the last part I wanted to review with you is applying practices. What can you do as a mental health worker or a healthcare worker to help move yourself or move others towards adapting and reconstructing? When I chose to do or when I was asked to do the grief and loss presentation, the one thing I never want to, I don't want to sound like grief is doom and gloom. It's not. It's a journey. It's a journey that we can definitely move through and transform through. And in the end, we are going to have some growth. And that's a beautiful thing. So I wanted to quickly show you phases of disaster. In my research, I came across this theoretical diagram, phases of a disaster. There is no information on phases of a pandemic, and it's congruent with our our emotional reactions through the phases of a disaster. That's kind of what this diagram is outlining. And you can see there's 6 phases. I want you to hone in on, well, pre-disastrous is really, there's a lot of fear and anxiety. Then we're impacted by it, and we experience a lot of chaos and a lot of questioning and uncertainty, and it just feels really chaotic. And then we kind of swoop in and we're starting to make changes, and we're thinking we're going to get a hold of this. The honeymoon phase, and I can distinctly remember myself being in this honeymoon phase of we're coming together as a community, we're making a difference, we're going to do everything we need to do to get rid of this coronavirus. And it's kind of altruistic, where I'm going to do what I need to do for the greater good. And the question that professionals or the researchers out there have said is, are we now in disillusionment? Are we in the disillusionment phase of this pandemic? And you can see the very steep fall from honeymoon to disillusionment. This is where we begin to, I'll flip to the next slide. This is where we begin to realize that it's going to be here a while, and things are not going back to normal. We will have to continue to adapt to change. And it's kind of a realization that we have to keep going through this. So this is a time I wanted to hone in on the disillusionment phase, because this is a time that mental health workers are needed. And we are quite possibly in the precipice of the disillusionment phase to make a difference and make a change throughout people's lives. So these are just some statistics. It's the 4 to 6%, I'm looking on the right, of people who typically develop PTSD after a disaster. It's pretty low, 4 to 6%. So I'm hoping to give you some motivation and energy behind this to say we can make a difference. If we go through the steps of acknowledging and teaching people what they're going through, then we can adapt through it. This is another Washington State Department of Health actually forecasted the emotional reactions through the phases of the disaster. Something I really think is important for us to look at, and if we put the phases of disaster right on top, you will see that suicide, violence, and abuse could possibly be at its highest right now. If we are in the disillusionment phase, we could be experiencing or about to experience higher risk for this. To me, that just tells me that we are needed, and we are here. So that's a wonderful and beautiful thing. All right, so what else? Now that I've hopefully, again, driven home the reason for us being here, is I want us to recognize how can we help others. The first thing we can do is educate and assist, whether we're acknowledging it for ourselves or we're gently helping a coworker to acknowledge, do you think you might be experiencing some grief? Or maybe it's our patient or provider. Niemeyer, who is an expert in grief, he states that it helps to name and claim our grief. And it's as simple as that. An example might be just simply telling yourself, I am grieving the change of my life as I knew it before coronavirus. Simple. Call it what it is. And so the idea, David Kessler says something to the same effect: if we can name it, then perhaps we can manage it. And that's really our goal as healthcare professionals, is to educate them and help those who are grieving to recognize the fact that they're grieving. It's an empowerment statement to say, I know what I'm experiencing it. It helps us to actually allow the feelings to come, and then we move through it, and we can grow and get to a different place, a better place. The second step that we can do in order to help people through their grief and loss is to focus on what you can control. Well, we know that we had a lot out of our control due to the pandemic, but there still are things that we can control. And this is really being intentional here. And I know I mentioned with grief, we're tired. We are tired of all the change. So we might have to really pull up some energy somewhere, but the reward is greater. So you can see the list here. When possible, take breaks if you can. I mean, this is so simple about really taking a look at what can I control today, right now. That's very helpful in dealing with other things that are, I'll kind of say, swirling around us that are out of our control. I know we had yesterday a presentation on mindfulness that was fabulous. These are taking short times maybe to be mindful can absolutely be helpful. So as much as we're wanting to recognize what's what we have in control and mentally focus in on that, we also have to practice letting go of the things that we cannot control. So in your work with yourself, with your peers, and definitely with your clients and patients, this is something you want to address with them. What is it that we're worried about that we can't control and we want to let go? I often tell my clients, we're not going to be perfect at that. Okay. You might have to agree multiple times a day. Nope, got to let it go. If I can let it go, it's not serving me. I can't do anything about it. I'm going to let it go. I also want to say, one very important thing to let go of when we're grieving is unrealistic expectations. It's our own thoughts most of the time that kind of keep driving up our frustration. We may not be functioning on the same level we were before the virus, and to keep having the expectation that we place on ourselves that we should be, it's not going to help us move through that grief process. So again, part of what we can control is that thought process. Be a little more balanced. I'm grieving. It's going to be okay. I might be a little slower, but we'll get there. So in other words, we're kind of validating ourselves. Stay connected. So I've had so many conversations. We work with, I would say 75% is an older population, and they are in fear of the coronavirus. A lot of them live alone. They are widows and widowers. They are absolutely isolated. I find myself having this conversation over and over. You might have to get creative. I have practiced Zoom calls with some of the elderly. I think the greatest reward sometimes for them is they figured out the technology. It's actually pretty rewarding for myself, but encourage them to stay connected as often as they can. I've had clients even decide to meet up with a family member. They were both in their vehicles. They rolled the window down and talked for an hour. And they love the face-to-face. So we can do it. And I'm asking you to be creative. If you can't think of something, ask for ideas from others. Ask your clients to come up with ideas of what's in their realm that they can stay connected. It can be a simple text once a day, just to know that you're anchored to someone. But I want to drive home to you, staying connected is so important. I think with our social distancing, I know there's been a lot of debate on the social distancing, how it gives a message to stay, it disconnects people. But just remind them you can remain physically distanced and definitely continue to connect socially. Create an adapted routine. Right? We're in chaos. Our routine went right out the door. I think it depends on the individual as to what's going to be most meaningful to them in their routine. Keep it basic. I think that's one of the biggest conversations, again, that I have is when the world is chaotic, the best place to go is back to the basics of our foundation of what is helpful to us. Sometimes I tell my clients, really, it's not rocket science, not at all. It's the most basic of foundations, and one of that would be a routine. Prioritize our basic needs and physical health. So much of the material that I went through and read absolutely focused on your simple, I'll go through them right now. Your sleep hygiene. Sleep is important. Nutrition is important. Regular exercise and movement is important. So I'm leaving it up on sleep because I love the fact that they recommend to create a COVID-19 free wind down. So for the last hour to 2 hours before you go to bed, eliminate any information related to the coronavirus. I might go as far as to say eliminate any information that's going to not give you a restful sleep. So shut it down. It's time to get settled. It's time to get in a good place and get relaxed. For what that is for different people, I think we have to come up with it on our own, but certainly recognize sleep is the most foundational piece to one of our functioning, and it is important. So I couldn't go without saying, of course, physical activity, nutrition. I know for a while we talked about the coronavirus or COVID-19, but we called it 19 pounds of coronavirus. We were not moving as much, right? We're exhausted, we're tired, we're trying to figure things out. And the last thing we thought of is our nutrition. So small steps though, small steps, small goals. And hygiene, although this, for people who do shift work, who are completely exhausted and inundated at work, inundated at home, you might forget to brush your teeth. It's very true. I know when I had twins and I had a family member ask me, "Did you brush your teeth today?" And I thought, well, what an interesting thing to ask. And I thought about it and I said, actually, I don't think I did. And so we giggled, but it's one of the, and I'm a regular teeth brusher, I will say. But it's interesting in the midst of chaos and things going on around us that we will, some of those regular routines will go right out the door. So limit your news diet. I have that conversation a lot too for those who stay home regularly during the day. It's on Facebook or social media. It's on the news. It's on a lot of talk shows. So take a look at, I asked them to take a look at how much time they're spending doing that, and maybe we could dial it down a notch. All right, so the last thing, because my time is about up, I wanted to specifically wanted to cover this before I go, ways that we can help healthcare workers in the organization who might be experiencing grief and loss. And I know that some organizations have already done a fabulous job in being creative, but I do want us to recognize and take time to make sure we're creating space and time to check in on our peers and our coworkers. We tend to not self-care, but if we as an organization come together and create rituals. I actually read that one company, right at the end of a long shift, they take maybe 2 minutes, gather in a circle, and they say one word of how they feel. But it's the space and the presence that's the most important piece to supporting those workers. It's not necessarily what they said, but it's the fact that somebody said, let's do this. We're acknowledging that you may be experiencing grief and loss. So in review, I just want you to know that grief is a very normal and natural response to loss. We have experienced an amazing amount of loss through the pandemic, loss of life, and so many other losses in the way that we live our lives, that it's very natural and okay to validate that for ourselves. So I have awareness, know what it is, validate that for yourself, your peers, and your clients, tend it, allow it to happen, take care of it, and then we will absolutely adapt. And I'll leave you with this quote. It says, the human capacity for burden is like bamboo, far more flexible than you'd ever believe at first glance. And if I've learned anything about humans, is we are flexible and we can adapt. So I hope this leaves you with some motivation, even though we're experiencing grief and loss. We'll take, do we have any time for questions?
I don't, and I feel like the two questions that came in, and right when they came in, Heather, you went into those discussions
Oh, goodness.
about helping those that we serve understand complications of grief right now and how to help children with grief. And I think right when the questions came in, you kind of went into those topics. I will say we had over 200 comments that came through the chat box,
Wow.
most of which saying how much people have enjoyed your presentation, so helpful and so comprehensive. Thank you so much.
Thank you all. I hope you find it useful. There is at the end of the slides, I have a large resource page full of information on working with healthcare workers and children and adults, also those who've experienced maybe lack of burials and memorials. There's some good information on there.
Thank you again so much, Heather. This has been a great presentation.
Thank you.
Excellent information, just loaded with information. We
Thank you all
appreciate.
very much.
And thank everyone for participating today. And we will now go into, this is our last plenary session. The next sessions are 3 master sessions that we hope you all will join us for. This will be the last time that we're all together, that you pick a master session for this afternoon. And thanks everyone. And thank you to our partners, to Women's Foundation and Dream to Reality, who are handling all the streaming and video presentations. Thanks everyone for joining us. And we hope this has been a great event and y'all are learning something and enjoying it as much as we are. Thank you so much. Have a good day.